Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So what I'd like to do today about is our latest release, CloverDX 7.2. I have a couple slides, and then as usually, I'll show you a demo afterwards. So let's go through the slides first. As usually, our release cadence has not changed. And so a quick recap, this is the third release, or the feature release of the year. We will have one more in the middle of December, just before the holidays. So for CloverDX 7.2, there are a few highlights that I would like to talk about today. The first one is introduction of what we call Clover AI Assistant, which is the assistant that helps you build jobs in Wrangler. I'll show you how that works. We also improved the Wrangler and data catalog so that you can work with transactional data sets, not just reference data sets as you were able to in previous version. And we also have, of course, a number of improvements in Data Manager, like the ability to search and replace or use URLs in your data and have them shown as a URL instead of just a plain text and so on. Of course, there are many other changes that we have implemented in this release, and I'll talk about some of them as well. So first, let's talk about the AI stuff, because this is usually what people are the most interested in. As kind of a recap, when we think about the AI, there are essentially two different streams that we think about. The first set of features that you can do with AI in CloverDX is essentially transform your data. This is the left side of the slide, where the goal is to take your data, pass it through some sort of machine learning process, and get some other data out of it. This is usually some sort of data classification, data quality work, and so on. And this can be something that you integrate into your automated processes, for example, during data ingestion, and so on. This all happens as part of a job that you create in Designer. So this is implemented using a variety of components that we introduced in CloverDX 7.1, so 2 releases ago. These components include data classification components as well as OpenAI client. The interesting part about this is that we have functionality that allows you to run your AI workloads locally. So you do not need to send any data to cloud anywhere. Everything stays within CloverDX server, which means that you can guarantee data security because you are not sharing any data with anyone. But for example, a component like OpenAI client relies on being able to connect to OpenAI and call its APIs to interact with large language models that are published there. So obviously, when you are using this, you will be sending your data to OpenAI. So you can pick whether you want to do something locally for local processing, right? That has its benefits. And then you can also do something remotely or in the cloud by sending some data to OpenAI. The second set of features is where we think about AI as an accelerator for something that you do within the platform. So this is your typical assistant workload where instead of using AI to process your data, you are using AI to make your work easier or faster, right? So kind of like an efficiency boost. So this is exactly what we've done in this release. We have implemented what we call Clover AI Assistant, which allows you to work with Wrangler and create jobs by talking to it, right? Instead of creating jobs by selecting steps from a list of steps and so on, you can simply talk about what you want, and the assistant will figure it out for you. And again, these kinds of features, the accelerators or the efficiency boosters, again, can be implemented as something that's local, so runs within Clover server itself only, or something that requires a third-party vendor like OpenAI. For the AI assistant, this is the latter, so we actually require OpenAI connectivity to be able to do this. So let's talk about the assistant. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the assistant is a feature that allows you to create jobs in Wrangler without having to create them manually, kind of step by step, but rather by typing something into what we call the Ask Assistant box, and it will offer you suggestions for how whatever you asked for can be accomplished. You can see a little animation on the left side. I will, of course, show you a live demo of this. The assistant actually works in quite interesting ways, and it can help you in different things. It can help you build your transformations or data mappings. It can help you with data quality, error handling, and so on. It can also summarize jobs for you, so it can help you understand a job that maybe someone else has built or that you've worked on long time ago and you no longer remember what it does. So when we think about how the assistant works, it's actually fairly simple. As I mentioned, this is a feature that requires OpenAI, so it's kind of a bring your own key setup where you have to have an account with OpenAI or Azure AI Foundry. You configure that within the server, and from that point on, the assistant is available. The main entry point for the assistant is what we call the Ask Assistant box, and it's the little box on the bottom right screen where you type in whatever you want, and the assistant will figure out. What is interesting is that the assistant is design time only feature. So it's something that only applies when you are designing the jobs in Wrangler. When you run the job afterwards, it does not require any OpenAI connectivity or anything like that. At that point, the jobs are 100% deterministic, so they will run the same every time, regardless of how many times you run it. This is, of course, important when you are processing data through your jobs, and you need to make sure that it's not different. And if you've used any large language model before, you know that it doesn't respond with the same response to the same question every time, right? There can be variations, but the way that we build this in Wrangler is that the assistant makes suggestions of what you can do within Wrangler. And if you accept those, they are fixed. And those are the steps that are taken when the job is running. On the screenshot in here, you can see the AI assistant configuration, which is just very simple, as I mentioned. Essentially, you paste in the OpenAI key, and that's it. And you do not need to have any special hardware or anything like that, because the actual thinking part happens in the cloud. A very important topic for any AI discussion is the security and privacy of your data. So the way that this is built is with this in mind, of course, right? Because Clover is in many cases used to process sensitive and private data, for example, in healthcare or in finance industries, where you do not want to randomly share everything that you do with OpenAI or Microsoft. You need to make sure that you can control this kind of interaction. So by default, the assistant doesn't share any of your data with the AI provider, regardless of whether you pick OpenAI or the Azure AI Foundry. Only metadata is shared, meaning column names, dataset names, and types that you have there in the transformation, and so on. So this can still be sensitive, right? For example, if you name your column with like a password is something that will be shared with OpenAI. But usually this is not the case because column names, their types, and so on are not secret. They will not help anyone build what you have already. If you want to share your data, this is something that you can enable for every interaction that you have with the AI. So, for example, when you use the Ask Assistant box, which looks like this in the in Wrangler, there's a checkbox called Improve Answers. When you check this, it will share data or data sample with your AI provider, and in many cases it will help deliver better results, but it works without that perfectly fine, right? You don't have to do this if you don't want to. And obviously there might be situations where an organization wants to make sure that this doesn't happen by accident, right? So you can disable that. There is a setting in the server where you can disable this kind of data sharing. And when that is disabled, right, through the setting in here, the improve answers checkbox is not available and you cannot share data. Obviously, you can select, a bunch of cells from your data set and paste them into the request, but that's not something that we can guard against. Right? People will always find something to break whatever tools we built. So the important point is that by default, your data stays in your Clover server and is not shared with the AI provider. You have to make a decision to do that every time you interact with the AI. Of course, with the introduction of the assistant, we had to change something in the Wrangler, and because the assistant, for example, has additional context. And it remembers the chat history as you are talking with it and so on. So we've introduced the concept of a block into the Wrangler job, which means that the structure of the files themselves, of the jobs that you create in Wrangler, has changed a little bit. But good news is that we have implemented this in a way that you can open jobs from previous versions and you do not have to change them at all. Right? As a simple example, you can use this where this is a screenshot from CloverDX 7.1, so the previous release, And this is the same job that I opened in 7.2. And you can see that there is, slightly different layout. There's something called default block, and all the steps are in here just like they were before. Right? So it's a minor change, and the Wrangler will do this for you, so you don't have to go into your jobs and try to rewrite them. All the steps that were there before, whether they are the transformation steps, data validation, or anything else, they work in exactly the same way. There are some additional options for some of the steps, like the ability to choose different columns for the output and so on, but it's always an extension of what was there before, so you don't have to change your Wrangler jobs that you've built in the past at all. They can stay as they are, and you will be able to use them after the upgrade without any issues, right? Regardless that you did not create them with AI or not. Obviously, it doesn't work the other way around, right? So if I create something in 7.2 and I try to copy it to 7.1 server, the 7.1 server will not be happy because there's a new entity in the file called the block, which it doesn't understand. All right, enough about the assistant. Let's talk about the other features, and then I'll talk about then I'll do the demo a little bit later. So we've of course implemented many improvements in the data manager. There are smaller stuff like UI changes and so on, but there are a few bigger things. The first one that you can very effectively use to provide additional data about an entity that you have displayed in your data set is the ability to have clickable links as part of your data. And you can see a screenshot of what it might look like. In here, I implemented this to provide a very simple map search functionality, right? So you can see that I have a broken address in here. There's something wrong with the postal code or zip code. The state is not filled in properly, right? So we try to search that. So there's a link which looks like this inside, right? This is the link where it goes. So I'm using the Google Maps search, and this is something that you can do as part of your job that populates the data set. You can use Markdown syntax for your links. So in this case, to get something that looks nice, with a little globe and the link, I use this kind of syntax where I have the label in square brackets and the link itself in round brackets. You can also use just plain links, right? They will be displayed as they are, of course, truncated to whatever is the size of the column, right? So you don't have to use this kind of syntax. You can use just the link, but this makes it much nicer, right? You can, for example, implement buttons, use emoticons for the link label and so on, which makes it look pretty nice depending on what you pick. So this can be a quite nice extension of what you are already doing with your data in Data Manager. The second thing that you can try working with is what we call real-time suggestions. This is the ability to use data services instead of static suggestions. I don't have a screenshot of this, but this is where when you click on a value, for example, in here, the address state, this is a drop-down, right? Because there's only certain number of states, 50 in US. So when you click on the drop down, it will show you the list of 50 states and you can pick from that. But in some cases, you might be in a situation where you cannot pre-compute this. It's something that you want to provide dynamically, right? In 7.1, you didn't really have any option to do this. In 7.2, instead of using static suggestions, you can use a data service instead of that. And by clicking on the dropdown, it will go to the data service, which can return a list of items to display. This is something you can use to great effect even for something like this, because when a person changes the address, right, they can change anything in here, except for if they don't change the state, they can change other things, and you can compute the suggested state based on whatever is the rest of the address. And this was not possible in 7.1. Another feature that will make it easier to work with data sets is search and replace in Data Manager. This is a very simple feature to use. There's a button that you can use. It will show in a sidebar a dialog something that looks something like this. You pick a column, you select the value that you want to search for and replace with. It works differently for different data types, of course, right? So you have a number, it will be a number editor. If you have a date, it will show a calendar and so on. And it will replace all those values within the whole data set or within what you have filtered out with the new value. This is something that you can use very effectively to fix all kinds of common data issues. And it all runs as a single transaction. So it will never happen that, for example, you need to replace 100 values and only 50 of them happen, and then something happens and the remaining 50 don't. Either the whole thing succeeds or it doesn't. So you will always leave your data set in a consistent state. It never happens that you forgot something and that some sort of error was not updated. Um, and then when we look at the interaction between the Wrangler and the data manager, we have added the ability to use transactional data sets into data catalog and into Wrangler. In the release 7.1, we added reference data sets. So now with 7.2, you can use all of them. Whether you want to read from them or write to them, you will be able to use all of that. This is especially useful where, for example, you use reference data sets for lookups, and instead of having them in files or in libraries and so on, you can very effectively create lookups and have them as reference data sets in Wrangler. But you can also do, for example, data validation and so on, so that when you read data from a source, you can write it to a transactional data set and provide validation errors as you detect them within Wrangler. This is something that can be very powerful because you don't have to rely on your IT team to build your jobs that load data into your transactional data set, but you can very easily do that by yourself. And so with this, we essentially kind of close the loop with and have the ability to work with all data sets within Wrangler. Right, let's talk a little bit more about technical stuff. Of course, we have made some improvements in the platform itself. So starting with this version of Clover, we support Java 21 for server deployments. You can still use Java 17, so you don't have to upgrade there, but you also have the option of using Java 21. This is true for both stacks that we support, for both Ubuntu and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. You can see kind of a visualization in here. So for Ubuntu, you have to use Eclipse Tamarin. Java, so you can use JDK 17 or 21, and the same thing for Red Hat, but with Red Hat builds of OpenJDK and 17 or 21. In the next version of Clover, in 7.3, that we will be releasing in December, we will also upgrade the designer to use Java 21, so you will be able to use Java 21 across the board. And this is the same approach that we used previously, where we first upgraded the server and then worked on the designer. Right, and of course there are many other changes that are smaller, but might be still useful. The first that I want to mention is the ability to have more customizable error handling in the OpenAI client component. The component already provided fairly robust error handling opportunities, but we have improved that by allowing you to specify new callback methods for different kinds of errors. For example, when you are creating a new chat or or parsing the response from the AI, you can designate a new callback method to react to errors there, and you can handle them differently. For example, if something happens during the call, in the previous version, basically the call failed and you had to rely on the built-in error handling, but now you can decide to repeat it if you want to, right? And you can even ask the question differently, right? If you've sent something to the large language model and it responded that it wouldn't want to handle the request with some sort of error code, you can handle that and maybe rewrite the question in some other way to get a better response. We have also improved the security configuration of the server itself, where we now have new properties that allow you to configure the account handling and the password policies in more detail. And all of these were kind of hard-coded to specific values in the past. So now we have more configurable options for this. So you can, for example, specify the password aging, which was not available in Clover at all before. So you can say how long can your users keep the password, and after it's too old, they will be forced to change it and so on. And so this is useful mostly for organizations that do not use something like LDAP or single sign-on, because when you are using that, these policies do not apply, but rather the policies that you configured in your identity provider will apply instead. Right? But for those who are using the account management built into Clover, these policies can allow you to configure your passwords to greater extents than you were able to before. And a very technical change, but very useful. When I talked about the URLs or the real-time suggestions, you are able to use data services in both cases. And data services can move. When you change the URL of the server, the data service no longer is at the same address. And to make it very easy for you to use data services, we introduced a new protocol called DS as a data service. So you can use it like this. You specify data service as a DS colon / data service name. And regardless of where the server is, it will still call the right data service. So it's much easier to do it now without trying to query the server URL to build the whole address when you're, for example, creating those real-time suggestions and so on, right? It's much easier and much faster uh, to do it this way. And of course, there are some changes that that you should pay attention to because they change the compatibility of the product. The first one is that we removed the Tableau writer component. This has been deprecated since Clover 6.4, so for more than a year. So we've decided to remove this component because of the libraries that it uses. They are no longer supported by Tableau, so this is not something that we can support by ourselves. And we also introduced more granular permission settings for Data Manager. So you can see the difference on the screenshots. This is from Clover 7.1, where we had permissions like this, and we now have split the managed datasets permission into two different permissions. This was done in order to accommodate the new API. So we have a new Data Manager API that you can use from the server, and this uses some of these permissions to work. And so now you have more options for how to configure the permissions of different users when they access the data manager. Of course, this is an extension of the previous version. So if you upgrade Clover, your permissions will be automatically upgraded, but you should review them, right? You will not have any issues with using it, but there might be users where you want to turn off some of the permissions because now you have more options. So just review your settings after the upgrade and make sure that it's still what you want, whether you might not want to turn something off. For example, the ability to create data sets can now be separately disabled for use as well. It wasn't possible before. All right, so it's now demo time. So let's have a look at the Wrangler first. So let me just get my browser here. The Wrangler interface didn't change much, right? Jobs, the sources, targets, and all of that works in exactly the same way. The changes happen in the job editor. So when you create a new job and want to do something with it, that's where you will see the assistant. So I will create a new job as a simple example. And I'll use a very simple example with invoice processing where my data has just 5 columns that represent invoices. You have due dates, date paid, the amounts, and the currencies. So let's do this so that we can see what happens. And this is the change, at least on the visual side, right? When you have the AI assistant enabled, you will see the welcome screen when you start editing the job. And of course, the job structure is a little bit different when you have the blogs and so on. And the way that we designed this is to make it as simple as possible. So you do not need to do any steps manually. You can essentially type everything you want to do in here into the Ask Assistant box. And as I mentioned, the assistant itself has more than one function, or it can do more than that. So the primary thing that you will use is probably this, where you will interact with it and ask it to create a job with you. But you can also do summarize job. Whenever something is added there, it will tell you what the job is doing. You can ask it to fix errors, or you can ask it to help you with mapping. So let's have a look at some of this. So let's say that we want to figure out the invoices that have not been paid or that have been paid late, and we want to add a late fee to these invoices, right? And this is complicated by the fact that the invoices are all in different currencies. So we would want to convert them into USD and do the late fee on top of that. But I'll start with the filtering first. So let me just type in something, right? So I want to filter over the invoices from input dataset. And and this is when we send the request to the large language model. In my case, I have it configured to go to OpenAI, and it's now processing that. It can take some time depending on what you ask for. And it will either provide you suggestions of the steps that you can take to implement whatever you have asked for, right? So it will tell you whether you, for example, can use filtering step or anything else, or it can ask follow-up questions. If your request is not clear enough, or if there are multiple options to do something, it will ask you follow-up questions, and you can kind of lead discussions with the AI assistant. It seems to be taking some sweet time this time, even though the request was quite simple. And of course, the complexity of the request is not limited in any way. I'm using a very simple example, but you can type in, a very long request with lots of things, and it will simply work on that, and we'll try to figure out what to do with that. And when I talked about how this works, I mentioned that it's sharing all kinds of metadata with OpenAI, right? I have not checked the improve answers box, so I'm not sharing any of the data that I see in the preview in here, but it's sharing the information about what columns are there, what other data sources I have, targets, and so on, right? So the Wrangler can use, for example, lookups that are part of your data sources and work with those rather than you having to specify everything manually. All right, seems like it's really taking a lot of time today. Looks like some problem with my connectivity maybe. So I'll let it think for a little bit more. And in the meantime, there are a few more things that are interesting when you are working with the assistant. As I mentioned before, it remembers the history. So whatever I type in here, like the conversation I'm having with it, is something that is stored alongside your job. So there are new files in the workspace that store the history, and you can go back to it. So you can see actually how you arrived at a certain job, and whether it was something where it was just a short discussion or something where you had to work with it and discuss that. All right, so it seems that something happened in my connectivity. Let's go back and see if I can have one that I've already worked on before. And this one doesn't seem to show either. All right, so it looks like I have some problems with my connectivity with OpenAI. So let's try actually something else. I'll open a different job and I'll try a different request. Maybe that will go through. As I mentioned, one thing that it can help you with is the mapping, not just suggesting the steps. So you can go into the mapping, and here I have a job that requires certain data to be mapped in certain way. So let me just get rid of that. And we have new mapping tools that use the AI to figure out the mapping. The first thing is the quick auto map. That's what was available in the previous version of Clover, where it's not using AI at all. But we have two new options where it will be using the assistant either with the structure only, or it will share the data. Sharing data can help in some cases. For example, it can figure out that something should be a phone number, even though the column is not called a phone number or doesn't have any description that says a phone. It will simply look at the data and recognize there's a phone number. And in my case, I can see that I have three columns that I need to map. So let's just do the basic one. It should work. And on the back end, this creates a request and sends it to OpenAI, and I get my response pretty quickly now. So this is the mapping that it suggested. I can use that. And when I go back, right, as I mentioned, everything you do with the AI assistant gets remembered, right? So in here, this is a block that was created. This is the request that I had, and this is the mapping that it suggested, and I can show what was there. I can, of course, continue the discussion to add further steps and so on. So since my code activity seems to be back up, let's try to go back in here, and let's try to ask this thing again, right? So I'll paste it in here again and ask the assistant. And this is an interesting concept that we've introduced the block so that you can keep different things in kind of different contexts, right? The AI uses the whole block as a context, and the idea is that within one block, you will be solving one problem or one issue within your data, one step of your kind of business process. So in here, my first block will be just filtering data. If it works in the end, it looks like it's still having some problems, or it can be doing something more complex, right? So looks like this doesn't want to work anyway. So I'll try to do something different. Let's go back. As I mentioned, there are other things. For example, the AI assistant can also try to suggest something to do with your data when you do nothing, right? You load a file or you load some sort of a data set, and there's this little light bulb. When you click on it, it will look at what kind of data you have, and we are still not sharing any data, and it will suggest what you can do. And for example, one of the things that it suggested was to convert all invoice amounts into a single currency. I have not typed that anywhere, but it's still a useful thing to do, because if you want to do any kind of reporting, obviously you want to have a single currency, because like doing sums or averages on this is not going to give you any useful result. So let's try to do that. This is one of the steps that I would have taken anyway, right, afterwards, after I had filtered my data. So it figured out that this is something that I can do, and it will try to figure out the steps to implement this. So I'll give it a moment to think, all right, and we get the response. And you can see that the suggestion itself is relatively precise, but it doesn't tell it that it should use the lookups tab or anything like that, or there's no formula. And of course, the suggestion does have that, and because the assistant knows that it can use lookups and knows how to convert the exchange rates and then how to use exchange rates to convert. So I select this. And this is what I mentioned when I talked about it, where the assistant only applies during the design time, right? Now I have created the steps, and they are fixed steps that do not use any AI functionality at all. So if I run this job, and I can do it like this, it will be running for a couple seconds. So when I run the job, this involves no AI at all, right? The job will always produce the same results because the steps in here are already fixed and stored in the job. And whatever I do there, when it runs, it doesn't contact OpenAI at all, right? And it's still all the functionality that we had in Wrangler before, like comfortable working with errors, where it can push errors further down the line all the way to reject file at the end and so on. All that is still available. And as I mentioned, it remembers the context, so I can go back and continue the chat and do something more in here. I can ask for something else, or I can create a new block by trying to do something else, right? Like for example, we can try the late fees. Let's try if this request works. And I describe what I want, that I want late fees for invoices paid after due date, and whatever the fees, it's 1% of the invoice amount per day the invoice is late. So when you think about what should happen in here, it needs to subtract these two dates together from each other to figure out how long after the due date was the invoice paid. It needs to use the invoice amount in USD, and it needs to use the percentage to figure it out, right? So it filters out the invoices so that only those that are paid after due date are remaining in the data set, and then it's calculating the fee. So let's add select steps, and now I have few records, only 100, while I had more than 1,000 before. There are some errors, and because some dates are not valid or are empty, so it cannot subtract them. But we get our late fees, right? And I can, of course, then work on fixing the errors and so on to try to figure that out. But I have my late fee in here. So this is how the assistant works, right? And of course, you can continue the discussion and do more with the job afterwards. Sorry, apologies. All right, so let's talk about the other features that I mentioned as well. So we move from this to something different. Let's talk about the data manager. So there were a few things that I mentioned. The first one was the ability to do search and replace. So if I close this one, and I have a data set that I actually loaded in Wrangler, which is another thing that I mentioned. And I can go in here and load my data set from here. I have a file where I read this and write it to a data set, right? And to transactional data set like this. And the good thing about this integration is that the data set knows what layout it has, so it can offer me the mapping. In this case, it's very simple because I'm just mapping one-to-one because the file matches what I want. But of course, this can be more complex transformation. You can implement some sort of data quality stuff in here and load it into your transactional data set, and it will appear like this in your data. And in here, of course, I do have some data quality problems. I have not implemented any data validation at all in my Wrangler job, but I can see some things right away, like Sydney is not spelled this way, right? And there's a lot of those, right? If I look in here, I can try to filter by this value. So let's do that. And uh, let's see how many I have, right? And if I wanted to fix all of this manually in the previous version of Data Manager, I would have to go in and edit one by one, which of course is not very nice. And I only have 7, which is fine, or 6, sorry, which is fine, and I could still do it. But if I had 300, I would probably spend a day doing that. So what you can do is you can just do search and replace. I can select the columns, right? In my case, this is the star column, paste in the value that I want, and replace it with the correct spelling. The filtering and everything applies, right? So if I filtered it to something else, for example, just the revenue that's larger than 20,000, for example, it would only apply there, right? So I'll replace all of them, and that's it. Now the filter, of course, filters this value, so I don't want that. I won't see that. And when you do this, it of course keeps the audit. So I can look into the audit log and see that the value was changed from Sydney with I to Sydney with Y, right? Correct spelling. And that happens for every value. So we still keep the audit even if you do mass updates. And of course, this works for every data type and every column that you have in there. So you can even do lookups and so on. So this can make it much faster to work with your data. Another thing that I mentioned is the ability to have the links, right? So we've seen a screenshot from this data set where I have the map search as a link. This link is created when the data is loaded into the data set. In my case, this is done through a job created in Designer, but of course you can do that in Wrangler as well. And if you had a job that loads into a data set and it was implemented in Wrangler, you can create links just like I can do in here. And of course, I can click on some of them. Let's pick some which has a problem, right? So let's figure out where Quincy is, right? Because I don't know. Of course, I do have some suggestions based on that letter that I have. So maybe one of these states it is. So let's click on this one and we'll open a Google Maps. And Google Maps being pretty smart, it will figure out that it's Quincy in Massachusetts. So I can go in here and with confidence I can say that yes, this is going to be Massachusetts. And then you can work this way. You can do anything you want with the links. They can point to data services that can display, for example, invoice scans, which is one of the things that we worked on in the past, right? We had customers load invoices through Data Manager, and sometimes the scan is not legible, right? So the process that was converting the data into the pictures into the actual data couldn't read something or couldn't decipher something. So clicking on a link would show you the invoice itself, and a person can probably read it better than whatever machine was doing the reading in the first place. Right? So these kinds of things can be done. You can have any number of these columns to, for example, add different actions, even for different parts of the data set. All right, and that's essentially it from my side. So do we have any questions?
Yes, actually, we have 4 questions. The first one being, is the AI assistant available offline or does it require internet connectivity?
That's a good question. So the assistant requires the connectivity because it depends on either OpenAI or the Azure AI Foundry, depending on whichever you configure. So it will not work without that. But with that said, you can do everything in Wrangler without the assistant, right? Even when you have the assistant there, you can add steps manually and so on. So if the assistant is not available, either because you don't have connectivity at all, or for example, it's down, or you are over budget with your AI provider, then you can simply work manually just like you were able to do before. The history and everything is still kept, as I mentioned before. When the job runs, it's not using any assistant at all. So you can, for example, create the job using AI assistant and then run it without any internet connectivity. For example, on a different server even, right? You might have production where the AI assistant is not enabled and you just want to run your jobs there.
Nice. And we have another question related to the AI assistant, which is, will the AI assistant still work if users type in prompts in different languages other than English?
Mm-hmm. It does work, but actually doesn't provide us good results. We've tried that with different languages. We have people who speak about 5 different languages or 6 in the company. And it does work, but the instructions for it, right? There's a system prompt behind the whole thing and the documentation in Clover and so on. All of that is written in English. So if you write a request in a different language, it will still work, but it sometimes doesn't get as good a result as when you type it in English, simply because the other data that it has available is in English and it has to somehow match it. So I guess it's more difficult for LLMs to integrate multiple languages together when done like this.
We have a third and final one based on the AI assistant, which is, how does the pricing work for using the AI assistant?
Mhm.
Will I be billed by OpenAI, etc.?
Yes, that's actually a very good question that I didn't talk about. So as I mentioned, this depends on either OpenAI or Azure AI Founder, whichever you want works, right? They are in the end the same thing. So you will be built by them. You need to have an account either with OpenAI or with Azure to be able to use that. We use GPT 4.1 mini model, so it's like the previous generation. It's not expensive, right? It costs like small fractions of a cents for millions of tokens. So you will not get a large invoice from them anyway, depending on what you do, of course. But usually it's a very low cost. For example, during the development, we had executed tens of thousands of queries against it, of course, as we are building the feature, and it cost us like $50 or so, right? So you do not need to be afraid of typing stuff in here. It's not going to wreak a large bill because we are not processing data through AI. We are just sending metadata, which can be sizable if you have large data sets with many columns and so on, but it is still a very small volume of information that the AI needs to process compared to, for example, sending a sample, like if even 50 rows from here will be a lot of data compared to just information about what they are called and so on. And so don't be afraid of that. Experiment with it, and you can set up budgets with both OpenAI and Azure. So it will stop working after a certain point, right? So if you want, you can set it up to something like, I don't know, $20. And if you really push it, you might be able to reach that within a month.
Nice. And the final question, can multiple users collaborate on the same data set across Wrangler and Data Manager simultaneously?
Yes. Yeah, the data manager is fully transactional, so everything you do uh, is like kept track of. So if you have multiple users running jobs that work with the same data set, it will work. And so you can, for example, append records from multiple jobs running in parallel, and it will be just fine. You will not get any conflicts or anything like that. You just have to be careful, for example, when you do reference data sets, right? If you run the same job twice in parallel, you might get duplicate records because it will be loading the same data and so on, but it will be still fine, right? The data manager understands that kind of functionality and will either flag the duplicates so that you can easily remove them, or it will replace the values depending on how you configure it.
We have another question that just came in. So, is there no option to configure if we had an offline AI model?
Not for the AI assistant, because it really does require LLM. Uh, there are some models that were released like recently by I think OpenAI, right? They have 70 billion parameters and so on. They are less capable than the full model like GPT 4.1. You can run them locally. We haven't tried that. It's something that we thought about, but we will need to experiment with it a bit more. It's a very new thing. The like what I would call small language models, right, with just a couple billion parameters or millions of parameters, they are too simple to do what we need in here. They don't work for that. But with that said, you can use local models, but not in here. not to power the AI assistant, but you can use them from Designer. And I show you that. So I have a demo of that as well. For example, this one. Right, so this is doing token classification. Zoom in a bit. And the model that's in here is running locally, right? I don't have a GPU on the machine where this is installed, so it will be running fairly slowly on CPU, but you can do both, right? And the model is deployed within the server. In my case, I'm using Piranha model, and then you can go to the server itself to manage the models. Go there. And we have a new screen for that we introduced in CloverDX 7.1, where you can manage the AI models that are deployed on your server. Right, so I have 5 models installed, but you can of course have many more. You can either use your own, or you can use the models that we provide through Marketplace. And if you have any questions about that, like I'm happy to show you more detailed demo of that. It gets relatively technical when you want to do this, especially if you want to create your own models, so we can schedule a separate demo. So we'll reach out to you and we'll work with you afterwards, after the call.
Nice, and that concludes our Q&A session. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you all for coming along. As a reminder, we'll be sending you the recording and slides to your inbox shortly. But in the meantime, feel free to visit the CloverDX website for the full release notes or click the link in the chat box. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.